Hey, welcome here, everyone. We're back for another coaching call. We have Julia Stoesz joining us again today to present. So today it is on self-sabotage. It's one of the topics that came up when we kind of opened it up last week for any topics that people might be interested in hearing about. So with that being said, Julia, I will turn it over to you. Thanks again for joining us and for presenting today.
Okay, yeah, no problem. And I think I just see Carol joining. So this topic was her idea, so I'm glad she's joining us here now. So I thought, like, to start off, I would sort of ask the question, what kind of strategies have you tried so far when it comes to, self-sabotage? I know there's lots of books out there about motivation and that sort of thing. Is there any that you've read recently that you feel like are helpful? One that I read recently was The Atomic Habits. That was, all about sort of putting processes into place instead of sort of relying on willpower all the time. Great book. Anyone else have anything that's jumped out to them recently on this topic that comes to mind anyway?
I've recently read a book about the growth mindset by Carol Dweck. It's really good. That was a very good one for me. And also just trying to watch sort of inspirational videos. I mean, I've been on the PN coaching. There's this one, I can't remember which lesson it is, but it's got a bunch of videos just on nutrition and fitness and things like that. And so I've been watching those.
Sure. I know I hear a lot of you referring to precision nutrition. I have to admit, I don't know that much about it. So I don't know from what perspective you come at from that program, but yeah, I mean, growth mindset is something we talk a lot in counseling and psychology. So that sounds like a great perspective. Anyone else have anything that comes to mind immediately? No? Okay. So one of the things that I thought of as I was sort of pondering this topic over the last week, because it was Carol's suggestion and not my own, so I was trying to decide on what avenue I was going to go. And my thought went to some of these books and strategies, that are easy to find online, Mel Robbins and Tim Robbins and all these motivational speakers that are really good for sort of hyping you up and getting you moving. I am going to work under the assumption that if you're here, if you're interested in this topic, that you've seen and heard a lot of that kind of thing about how to motivate yourself from sort of a rah coaching kind of perspective. For some of us, I think that works quite well. I think some of us have a personality that is quite driven or quite easily motivated, and maybe those things help a lot. For me, probably, and for many of us, although it feels good in the moment, I don't find those strategies work all that well for me. And I think that's quite common. The direction that I want to take today is a little bit less of sort of strategies of how to motivate ourselves, and a little bit more along the lines of how to understand what's going on underneath the surface when we're kind of doing self-sabotaging behavior. And then, what to do sort of to approach that with some curiosity, to figure out what's going on, to figure out what we might need and that sort of thing. So it's a little bit of a subtle difference in approach. So I know, I don't know exactly sort of what Carol had in mind when she brought this topic up, but I'm assuming it has to do with the fact that, we all set these grand goals, and really good goals for either weight loss or eating well or whatever it is. And then we find ourselves sort of just not being able to make progress on our goals. And it's almost baffling, right? It's a little bit confusing. How come I can't do this? Because it is something that I want. It is something that I'm putting energy towards. I'm trying hard, and yet I find myself constantly not making the progress that I would like. So My assertion is that this is very, very normal and very human behavior. So I want to normalize that. I am not speaking from the position of being an expert on this topic, because I fall into these patterns all the time, and I'm going to assume that we all do. So when I think about this topic, I think of a few things that feel really important for me to address. One is that you are not a lazy person. We very easily attach this label of lazy to ourselves when it comes to not accomplishing our goals. And I just don't think that's true. I think if you look at your life and things that you are interested in, or workplaces where you feel really motivated, you can work really hard, and you can work beyond your comfort zone, and you can work long hours. And so I don't think that this is a matter of being lazy. I think we often sort of fall into that judgmental label of ourselves because we kind of do a comparison, or because that maybe is something we sort of heard growing up, or we've sort of, you know, compared ourselves, and somehow we just don't feel like it's enough. But I feel like that's an unhelpful judgment to make on ourselves. I think more accurate is to understand that our brains are wired for conservation of energy. So whatever the easiest route is, whatever the most familiar route is in our neural pathways in our brain, is going to be the way that we go, especially in times of stress. So one of the ways that I like to think about it is, so the neural pathways in our brains are like, you know, super highways. They're just really easy to travel. The same way that we've always done things, that's the easiest way. The cars run smoothly. It's just a super highway to where we want to go. So let's use, you know, exercise as an example. Sort of the super highway that we've sort of always done is maybe that we try once in a while to exercise, but for the most part, we tend towards sort of spending our time watching Netflix or sitting on the sofa or whatever. That's the easy route. That's, the brain is sort of used to doing that. That's simple. So if all of a sudden now we're trying to create a habit of being more active, of getting out, of going to the gym more often, we're all of a sudden trying to create a whole new pathway. So if, for example, you were out in the bush of northern Manitoba and you wanted to build a cabin, you would drive up on the road, and then you would tromp through the bush to find the spot that you wanted. And then you would go back to your car and drive out. And the next day you would come and you'd bring a few supplies and you'd walk down that same path. You'd tromp, it would take a lot of effort, and you would get there and you'd do what you need to do, and then you would leave back down the path. And if you did that every day, pretty soon that path would start getting packed down. It would get a little easier to walk on. Eventually you could maybe pull a wheelbarrow with, or a wagon with you with some supplies. Eventually maybe you could drive a bobcat or a truck or something down there, and eventually that path would get wider and wider, a little bit easier to use every time. Eventually, if you used that path enough, you would end up with a, you know, a road that other vehicles could drive up and down. It would just get easier and easier. So I say that in essence because it illustrates the difficulty at the beginning, right? When you start at the beginning, it's a tromping through the bush. It doesn't feel easy. It's a new way to go. But the more that you use that pathway, the easier it'll get, the more like a superhighway it will get. And so it really is a real process from a neurological perspective in your brain to create new habits. So that should just sort of normalize the process. This is difficult and your brain wants to do the easy route. And so give yourself some grace for that. It does take some time. The other point I want to emphasize is that you are likely scared. And that may seem a little bit weird to think about. You know, I just want to get fitter, or I want to lose a few pounds. What am I scared of? But again, from a neuroscientific perspective, our brains are really wired for safety, really wired to scan for any kind of threat and avoid it. So In the olden days, those were actual threats like lions and tigers and bears and those kinds of things that could actually kill us. These days, it's more like judgment. It's more like comparison. It's more about sort of feeling like we're not as good as. So our brains are constantly scanning for those threats and then are looking for ways to keep us safe. So some people have, you know, a fear of failure. They fear that they're just not going to be able to do it. Surprisingly, a lot of this kind of self-sabotage can actually come from a fear of success. Because the more successful that we are, the more we fear someone will expect from us the next time. So sometimes we can actually sabotage ourselves because we're fearing the success, not necessarily the failure. We can fear being judged. We can fear sort of looking over at the other person beside us and thinking, oh, wow, they seem to be able to do this so easily and I struggle with it. You know, what's wrong with me? Sometimes people fear being noticed. You know, my husband loves soccer and he collects soccer jerseys, but they're often really sort of bright colors and that sort of thing. So he has all these soccer jerseys, but he doesn't like to wear them because he doesn't like to sort of be noticed because they're these super bright colors. He's a very quiet person. So sometimes we're like, this fear bubbles up because we sort of feel like all of a sudden people are going to notice, you know, if we have a habit that's going to be of trying to eat better and we start bringing salads to work for lunch, you know, someone might notice and mention, hey, I've noticed that you've had salad every day this week. Are you trying to lose weight? Well, suddenly then we feel like our efforts are being noticed and now we kind of have to justify them or whatever. So sometimes just simply the fact that we might be noticed is scary. And a really common one is just fear of the unknown, fear of what might be expected of us. So anything that we're doing that we already know is so much easier than to think about trying to do something in the unknown. So it's really normal if we're thinking about all these fears that might be there when we start off on a new goal, that we just crave the comfort of what's familiar. We crave not having to push ourselves. And that leads us to choosing short-term comfort versus long-term goals. So that's, again, just to normalize, this is a normal process. We all have these fears. It can be helpful to sort of get curious about which perhaps are the fears that trip you up a lot, because that can give us some good information. Number 3 is that you probably, if this is something you struggle with on a regular basis, you know, perhaps some people struggle with self-sabotage in quite specific areas, maybe eating or exercise. Some other people find that this is quite a problem that happens in lots of areas of life. And if that's you, then it could be just that some of these things are a little bit deeply rooted and they just sort of come out in lots of forms. But one form that might be there is that you have quite a harsh internal critic. You have this voice in your head that just is very judgmental, kind of puts you down a lot, compares you with other people. You have a lot of sort of fears of failure, like we talked about before, feeling embarrassed to try. Some people have this really harsh coach in their head, you know, maybe from childhood, if you had to play as a sport and somebody was really demanding, you might sort of have that kind of voice in your head that's always saying, try harder, try harder, try harder. You might be the kind of person that has an internal dialogue that has a lot of really black and white statements, you know, I have to do this, I must always, I'm never going to succeed. If you find yourself using a lot of those very black and white terms, it's an indication that you have a really harsh internal critic. So those are normal things. They just pop up. It's kind of subconscious on most, in most situations. So it's not something you're choosing to do, but it is something that you may have to choose to start working on to try to learn to use some less extreme language with yourself. So, you know, instead of saying, I have to go to the gym 3 times this week, you can say, well, I'm choosing to go because, and try to, you know.
Woman from Morden Alliance.
Sorry, oh, I'm hearing somebody. making comments. Okay. I'm just going to keep going there. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, so we're going to use as much as possible to try to change some of those really extreme language to language about choice and responsibility. I choose to do this, or I want to do this. Try to connect to sort of the whys behind it rather than feeling like I have to. Another major reason that this might be a problem is that you have tendencies toward perfectionism. Quite often we don't really like that word because we sort of picture, you know, the Instagram model perfect, and we think, well, I'm not that person, so how could I call myself a perfectionist? But perfectionism can also really look like the type of person that has trouble just getting started at things, or you know, always setting goals and not following through. And it could be that the perfectionism takes a form that it sabotages you before you even get started. And so the perfectionist term does not necessarily have to be that person that's all put together. It's a really tricky mindset. It kind of has lots of ways that it shows up. It can make you want to avoid life, really. It can make you want to withdraw into your house so that you don't have to appear imperfect to anyone. It's a lot of what's behind procrastination, for me anyways, and I think for a lot of people. I'm sure that you can relate to that. I think perfectionism can be behind a lot of sort of our numbing behaviors when it just feels easier to sit on the couch and watch Netflix rather than getting out and doing something. It can be because we just don't know where to get started. We feel like we have to do the right things. And it can show up in sort of chronic underachieving when we know we have the capability to do bigger things and we're just not getting there. We can have very black and white thinking regarding our goals. We can sort of assume that either we hit our goals 100% or we're a failure. You know, if we make a goal that says I'm going to make it to the gym 3 times a week and we only go twice, we feel like a failure and then we kind of stop trying. Perfectionism can also show up in how we compare ourselves to others, even though other people have really different backgrounds and abilities. And we can set really unrealistic goals. You know, we can try to lose a ton of weight in a couple months, or we can go out there and say, I'm going to, you know, run a marathon in a year. And it just may not be realistic if we're the kind of person that's never done anything like that before. So those 4 things can be things that are really underlying all this self-sabotaging behavior. So they're not things that can be easily solved. We can't snap our fingers and suddenly they're gone, but we can start to work on them. We can start to engage differently with them. Some of the strategies, so the second thing we'll talk about are a few of the strategies that can help combat some of those things. So we talked about the first one last week, cultivating self-compassion. I personally think this is a really important skill that is a part of tackling just about anything in life. We talked about that a little bit more last week, so I'm not going to go over it all today, but there is a really good resource at the end if you think this is an issue that you could be working on. A book that I found really helpful with a lot of exercises in it called The Compassionate Mind Workbook. And so just to review, self-compassion is just about learning to treat ourselves in a more kind way. It doesn't mean giving ourselves the ability just to do whatever we want, to not hold ourselves to our goals, but it just is teaching us to be kinder to our own experience. So the second strategy is also pretty obvious. Set smaller goals or give yourself a longer time. So be really realistic. If you are not an exercise person, then you're not going to be able to do both the learning to exercise and losing a bunch of weight and changing your whole diet all at the same time. So I'll give you an example from my life. So I am really not much of an exercise person. I've tried in fits and spurts over my life, but really I've had trouble sticking with anything in particular. So when I started at Rise, I knew about myself that I knew I couldn't focus on all those things at one time. So I did the initial, intake interview where they weigh you and take the measurements and everything. And then I started doing my workouts, and I knew very specifically that I could not weigh myself and I could not go back for a checkup on how I was doing, because I knew immediately that would discourage me. I didn't want to know how much I weighed. I didn't want to know anything about that, because I knew that my single focus was I had to learn to enjoy being at the gym. So my only focus was, how can I get there? How can I learn to enjoy this? So for a year, that's what I've been focusing on. I have sort of just totally ignored the scale, totally ignored trying to change my eating habits. I just want to figure out how to enjoy being at the gym. And I have. And so now I can start focusing on some other goal. Maybe this year I'll start focusing on trying to eat a little bit better, that sort of thing. So just really try to work at keeping your goals really, really small. And I know there are times when I get tempted to weigh myself or to start thinking that my goal needs to be easier or bigger. But I do better if I remind myself that I only have to do small goals at a time, and I can change my goal later on. But for now, that's all my goal is to learn to enjoy being at the gym. So something like that can be very similar. It can be something that you can do in your life. Strategy number 3, to banish perfectionism. So if you notice that that's a tendency of yours, start to notice why. Start to notice what the dialogue is behind that perfectionism. Do you start to judge yourself? Do you start to are you the kind of person that sort of wanders around your house aimlessly because you're not sure where to start? Are you the kind of person that just can't commit to one thing? There's always sort of another bright, shiny exercise routine that all of a sudden you want to jump on to. What is it that sort of catches your attention? Let your your progress count, even if it's imperfect. So try to really avoid the all or nothing thinking of either I accomplished my goal or I didn't. Try to spend some time thinking about the ways that you did accomplish your goal, even if it wasn't perfect. Another major strategy is to really be sure that you're identifying your motivation. And generally, that has to be a motivation that really resonates with you, not with sort of a standard that somebody else has. So if you're trying to lose weight because your partner would prefer it, is not going to be nearly as motivating than your own value of, I just want to feel better. I want to be able to walk up a flight of stairs without huffing and puffing. What is your motivation? And do your best to keep that motivation really front and center. Remind yourself of it often, whether that's with affirmations or notes on your phone, whatever it is, to remind yourself of the why that you're using to motivate yourself. Another strategy is a concept called distress tolerance. We talk about this when it comes to addictions nowadays. And that's like, how can we tolerate the discomfort of not getting that next fix or that next drink or whatever it is? How to learn to tolerate the emotional discomfort that comes. So this is a real skill that we need to learn, and many of us get distressed really easy when we start to feel emotions, and that's when we go the easy route to whatever feels comforting. So if we can extend the time between sort of feeling distress and reacting to it in a reactive way, we have a better chance of making a value-based decision. So let's say I start to feel uncomfortable about, I start to feel bad about myself for some reason. My go-to is to start eating ice cream or something that feels comforting. But if I can extend that time, if I can think to myself, okay, I'm feeling bad about myself, I want to go and eat that ice cream, but I'm just going to sit with this discomfort a while. Eventually, you can usually make a decision that feels more in line with your values. So perhaps I would say, I'm just going to get up and discharge some of this energy by going on the treadmill for 10 minutes or something like that, rather than going to what is easy and eating the ice cream. So if we can learn to tolerate emotional distress, usually we will make better actions according to our values. There's a really great resource in the resource section. It's actually a whole workbook that you can download if you're interested in that topic, about distress tolerance, and just walks you through it and what's happening and how to respond. And the last major thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of strategy is to not take ourselves too seriously. Sometimes as adults, we sort of think that we're not really allowed to be playful anymore, and we feel like everything has to be really serious and everything has to be really high standards. And so I think we need to learn to be a little bit more playful in our lives, to take ourselves a little less seriously. We can get really fatigued mentally by always sort of trying to figure ourselves out or figure out why we can't do this or that, to try to always be sorting through these things in our mind. So I recommend finding time in your days and your weeks to do activities that have no other purpose than they're just enjoyable. It gives us a chance to get out of our head. It gives us a chance to just connect to ourselves and our joy in life and that sort of thing. It just gives our brains a break, usually makes it easier to make value-based decisions later when it comes to our goals. And also, with the not taking ourselves too seriously, ensure that you're doing your best not to compare yourself with other people. Just because you're similar in age or background doesn't mean you're going to be able to keep the same standards as other people. It really, comparison is rarely helpful and usually just discourages us. So walk your own path, charge towards your own goals, and do the best you can to keep your focus on that. And the last thing I'll say is that, like creating that pathway in the bush, these things take time to learn. They're not easy. They're going to feel really awkward at first. They're going to feel like it's kind of meaningless. I just need to get to it and work harder. But I think the more that we can cultivate the compassionate side of ourselves and the way of talking to ourselves, in the long term, it's going to help us accomplish more goals in life. So do the best you can to keep learning the ability to be empathetic towards yourself, keep learning your ability to tolerate your own emotional distress, and keep working towards your goals. So that's really all that I had to say. I know that I charged through a lot, but I don't want to monopolize all the time here. Any particular responses, questions to what I've presented? I know I went through a lot quite quickly. Does it resonate with you?
I think for me, the all or nothing is something that I struggle with. It's either I'm on it and I'm perfect, or I'm way off. So I find for me that's something that I'm really having to work with, and yeah, that's something that I really have to work with, and I have to so learning all of these lessons. I was just typing notes as you were talking here, and it's something to always keep in mind, and not expecting perfection all the time, and to know that you don't have to be all on or all off.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an important one.
I definitely had a couple that resonated with me too. I wouldn't have necessarily thought of them as self-sabotage tendencies, but kind of the harsh internal critic, kind of using those. I've done a lot of reframing of trying to say, okay, it's okay. I just have to make, as long as I own the decision, right? So kind of some of those things that you said there, like I'm choosing this and just recognizing that. And then also kind of the perfectionism, kind of what Chris said there too, where just kind of, well, if I can't do this as good as someone else, why am I the one doing it, or something like that. So yeah, I wouldn't have necessarily thought of them originally as self-sabotage tendencies, but a couple of these definitely resonated with me, but then some of the strategies to help were really great there, Julia. So thanks for sharing those strategies as well.
Anyone else?
For me, I kind of agree with Chris about the all or nothing. And sometimes well, I get kind of competitive in the gym. I love the group training and stuff, but sometimes the coaches, well, I guess depending on where I was with my goals, but sometimes my goals were to hit whatever lifts or whatever, and then it just seemed like, okay, or I told them at that point I wanted that extra push, and then it was okay in another season to be like, okay, now I don't want the coaches to push so hard. Now my goal is just going to be to show up or whatever. Like today I feel like garbage, but my goal is going to be to show up at the workout. So, and then I'm going to have the courage to say, no, I don't want that extra push today. Just leave me alone or whatever. Or not leave me alone. Like they're always encouraging or whatever, but in the right way. But yeah, it's just having the, I guess, the guts to say, you know what, now I'm kind of not at that stage where I'm trying to do this. It's okay to just show up.
Yeah, that's really important to recognize. I think you said two important things there. One was the ability to speak up about that if you feel like you need to, like this is right about now is just not the time that I need that extra push. So I just need it to be a little bit simpler right now. You also talked about enjoying the competition. And so, I mean, sometimes we do have personalities that really enjoy that competitive nature. And so that can be a blessing and a curse sometimes, but that could be a piece that you connect to in terms of the playfulness, right? Like perhaps that is something that you can reflect and you're like, oh, I really like it when we sort of like do this one thing and we go head to head, and that's, you know, that's a thing that really motivates you. So if you know that about yourself, you can use pieces of that to create a sort of a more playful experience at the gym. But it's not always going to feel right for you, or there might be, you know, seasons of life where it just doesn't feel as good, but it could be a source of strength and motivation for you because it is part of your personality, right?
Julia, you had so much good stuff in there. I'm just trying to take it. Oh, am I muted?
Nope,
No, I'm good. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I started taking notes like halfway through, and so I need to go back and I actually want to listen to this all over again because there's just so much good stuff in there. But it's just some of a few things that kind of stuck with me. I guess. Oh boy, there's so much here. Sometimes getting close to that success, or like when that sabotage happens, it's when there are good things happening, and then if there's attention drawn to you, or like someone who doesn't like the spotlight or anything like that, suddenly something's different or something's changing. So I found that that's kind of sometimes been a trigger maybe for me, or even just the fear of that success at times. And just finding the why too. You mentioned that maybe in a different way, but kind of finding the deep reason, right? And when you started off, I'm a strong believer in the Atomic Habits kind of philosophy. I love that book. It's just super. And so for me, it's definitely not relying on that willpower, because that willpower is so small. Like it's not supposed to be the muscle that keeps you strong. You need to have your systems in place, right? When your systems, your routines, your habits are in place, then yeah, you'll have willpower, but that is not the big thing that's going to take you, right? So just kind of getting that foundation through the Atomic Habits book. I found a lot of really good stuff in there. Boy, what else? There was so much here. And having fun, like just,
Yeah.
I think as adults and right now in this time, like, who's gone out for fun lately? Not a lot of us, right? So yeah, just thinking about those things. Oh, and extending the time between the distress and the decision. Is that what you were taught? Or those the words you used? And like how much damage can be done from in that time, right? So if you can extend that time, does that make sense what I'm even saying? Anyways, that resounded with me, but yeah, there's lots. I want to go and listen to this again.
So just to touch on that, I guess the theory behind that is so much of what we do to self-sabotage is unconscious, right? We have this feeling, the feeling doesn't even register with us yet, and then we're already responding to it by eating the cookies or cake or whatever it is. And then
Right.
it's not,
Yeah,
and
that
it's not
emotional
until
part of it.
afterwards that we're like, oh wow, yeah, something just happened because I just ate a bag of cookies. But if you
Right.
can if you can sort of like notice it, what's happening first, and then
Yeah.
even give yourself the chance to notice, you might still eat the cookies,
Right.
but at least you're giving yourself a chance to notice what the emotions are. I mean, notice what the needs are, and eventually
Exactly.
you'll be able to attend to them differently.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And for the record, I liked Atomic Habits. It was a really good book,
Oh
and I really
yeah.
like the idea. I like the idea of processes
Right.
rather than having to like force yourself to do something. To me, that makes a lot of sense. It is a very
Exactly.
self-compassionate philosophy as well. It's not like just get
Yeah.
out there and do this, right? It's
Yeah.
let's create a whole system where this works well. Yeah. So.
And so it makes it easier for you, right? So you don't have to put all of that effort and work into making decisions because they're just coming through your habits, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I also believe strongly in the difference between values and goals. And I'm not sure that's always a distinction that people make. So when we talk about goals, you know, we always hear about the SMART goals, you know, they have to be, you know, I don't even know, specific and whatever, measurable and all those kinds of things. They have to be very specific, and there has to be a timeline, all that kind of thing, which can be really helpful. But the flip side of that is I think it can be more helpful to define what our values are. So a value is something that doesn't have an end date. I just want to be a healthier person. I want to be a person who values myself enough to focus on my health. So if we can connect to those values, it's not a goal that we're going to finish. It's just a direction we're always heading. That's the highway that we're on. And that can help us as well, because it's kind of a deeper and a bigger process, right?
I think that's something too, Julia, that I've had to learn as a coach, right? Because we do have some people who come to us for just general health, right? It's not about the number on the scale. It's not about how much they can lift. It's they know they feel better when they're coming versus when they're not doing anything. And I think even as a coach, that's something that I've had to learn a little bit, that that's okay. We don't have to set a goal. But then on the other hand, but then still using that keeping that value, if it's not a goal or an affirmation that you're putting, keeping that value front of mind, right? So because, you know, the goal sometimes can help you motivated on those weeks where you don't really feel like coming. But then remembering that the value can also be enough to help them coming on those weeks.
Sure.
Yeah, that's definitely been a different mindset as a coach, where what do you mean you don't have a goal, you don't want to increase your lift, you don't want to lose weight, why are you here type of thing. And just understanding that general health, and that, I guess, putting that label on it as just a value is I like that. That's a really great helpful tool as well.
There's a really great book I only just discovered in the last 2 weeks. It's in the resources here. It's called Finish. If you have a Kindle, it's for sale for $1.99 right now, so get on there and buy it. But it was a great, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here right now. What were we talking about? Oh, values. It was a great discussion about sort of, don't be afraid to figure out what motivates you too. So for some people, having a goal will be very motivating. That's their personality. For other people, they're going to tend more towards values. But also he emphasized the playfulness. Figure out what works for you. I mean, some people, you know, even as we're adults, and it sounds really silly, some people really like to have a chart where every day they're getting a sticker put on, you know, where I went to the gym each day and they can see their progress. You know, for some people that's very, very motivating, and we shouldn't feel ashamed that that's something we enjoy. That's the playfulness aspect, right? If that works for us, more power to you. Do it. Don't be afraid of looking silly or whatever it is. And for me, like, obviously, I think I must be motivated by connection and community, because for me, one of the best things has been to find somebody who I know is waiting for me at the gym, right? So some people are really motivated by that too, and they want to know that there's a friendly face that they're going to recognize when they get to the gym, or that's going to miss them if they don't show up. That kind of thing can be very motivating. So if you know what your personality is drawn towards, you can harness that as well. Any other questions, comments? Good. Well, the handout is there if you do want to read through that, look at the resources, if you want to ponder that a little bit. My email is there if you have specific questions. Feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I guess we'll kind of call that the end for tonight. Do you have anything else you wanted to say, Carrie?
No, other than just thanks again for doing this, for joining us through the month of May here. Really appreciated.
No problem.
Thank you so much, Julia. That was fantastic.
Good.
Thank
I'm
you.
glad. Yeah, you're welcome. Have a good night.
Yeah, you too. See you, everyone.
Bye.
See you.